All right, we've been thinking through Carl Trueman's book, Strange New World, and talking about basically so far he's traced thought, the history of philosophical thought that sort of has gotten us where we are today. And in his chapter 5, The Revolt of the Masses, one of the things that he gets at is, so here's the question: what drives societies to adopt the ideals that they have? Is it philosophers and thinkers, or is it basically material things and the economy, economic relations, production? And there's a lot written about this. He acknowledged that, and he also acknowledged that he wasn't going to solve that in any one thing. The reality is that both of these things, that's sort of the yin-yang of our culture, that both of these things, philosophies and thought, those things have a tremendous impact, particularly among cultural elites and among in sort of the education class. But technology, economy, this is where people live. They live based on economic status, the things they possess. And so these two factors really sort of guide our culture. He talked about, Marxism, and Marxism is the thing that is behind what is often referred to today as critical theory. And then you can fill in the blank. Critical race theory is a thing making a lot of news these days, but that's just one part of critical theory in general. And Marxism holds that cultural values are simply a reflection of underlying economic realities, and that cultures make decisions based on economic realities, and that those things need to be completely upended and revolutionized all the time. And then idealism holds that it's thought, that it's that thoughts and ideals and principles are the decisive factors the way societies are organized and behave. But Carl Trueman makes the case that really it's both of these things. Both of these things have a role. And so far what he has shown us is what he calls preconditions. What are the things that have had to happen to get us to where we are today? And he's constructed this narrative of ideas that make the current, what he calls the authorization of inner feelings. That is, that what I feel I am is what guides life, and frankly, my feeling is the thing that should govern everything, and specifically the sexual and political dimension of those feelings. He says that this narrative ideas has gotten us to this place where our feelings sort of trump everything else. Now, he points out that it's not that like these philosophers come out with these ideas and the whole world goes, ooh, this is the right thing. It's sort of that they take hold over time. Marx died in absolute poverty. He wasn't popular in his day. It was after his death that people grab onto his thought. Nietzsche, same thing. Nietzsche dies after 10 years of insanity. He dies completely isolated and really with very little impact. It's what happened after they died that as people grab onto their ideas, particularly in the academy and particularly among the governing elite, that these things take root. And so he says that even though you might look back at these guys and say, well, their ideas really aren't significant because look what happened to them. He says, no, these are the preconditions that had to exist to get us where we are, that those thoughts and ideas taking root over time is what got us to this place. And he says that he describes it as we've gone from a fixed world to a plastic world, a world that is malleable, a world that we feel that we're not bound by the limits of both culture, society, and even physicality itself. And this is new. This could not have happened in any previous generation, really. So he said, imagine that you lived in 14th century England. Well, here's the truth. I'd like to think that I'm royalty. The name York, the Yorks were a royal family. York, the Battle of the Roses, the War of the Roses in England was between the Yorks and the Lancasters. And I'd really like to think I descend from royal blood. But the much more likely case is that, my ancestors were some peasants who lived in York Minster. And when they took the last name York because that's where they were from, but really not a whole lot of chance I'm a blue blood. We like to think that. Anytime people talk about past lives and stuff, they always romanticize and idealize it. Oh, they were Genghis Khan or something. Nobody goes, oh, I was the milkmaid. And we tend to think of ourselves in grandiose terms. But he says, if you're born in 14th century England, everything about your life is set from day one. And you're born into a circumstance that the odds of you changing those circumstances are virtually nil. So if like in England, you've got a stratified society. You have the royals, then you have the lords, the landowners, and then you've got the serfs, the people who live on the land, and they till that land, they produce crops on that land not for themselves, but for the Lord, the local landowner. And then you got the real peasants who they don't even live in one of the Lord's houses. They're sort of just really, truly subsistence living. And it's not like there's some social ladder for you to climb. If you're born a peasant, you will never be a landowner. You cannot, because the king of England is the one who gives the right to possess land. And the king of England will protect his own position by giving the right to own land, by giving these titled lands to people that are predisposed to him. And so this is passed down patrilineally from father to son. And if you're not born into one of those landowning families, there's not a lot you can do about that. There's no way for you to sort of save up and buy something. Now so what you're born into is fixed, and it doesn't change. I mean, you don't get to go to university if you're a peasant. There's no way out of that, and you're just stuck. And by the way, what church do you go to? You go to the one that's right there. You go to the Catholic Church, and the Catholic Church is parochial, meaning there's one church for this area of land, and everybody that lives there is a part of that. I mean, you're born, you're baptized in the Catholic Church. Whether or not you believe it is sort of irrelevant. You're sort of taught it. But even the way the Catholic Church at that point treats peasants and serfs, very different than the way they're treating landowners and royalty. So everything is fixed. And you say, well, then I'll move. Well, where are you going to move, and how are you going to move, and what are you going to do when you get there? Are you going to compete for work? Again, there's no marketplace of ideas. There's no marketplace of jobs. You're going to grow up and live in that same place. You're probably going to only know just a limited number of people, whoever lives in your village, and you're going to marry somebody that you've known from the time you were children, and your life is going to depend on the change of the seasons. Your life in winter will be very, very different than your life in the summer because you're dependent on all that, gathering wood and cooking and then the disease. You read any of the histories of the royalty in England. I remember reading about Elizabeth I, and every summer she would go on what they called on progress, which basically was a fancy way of saying she got out of London. Why? Because the disease in London in the summer was outrageous. And so she would travel around England in the fresh air. She would stay with landowners, in different castles and stuff she had around the country, or with some of the dukes and duchesses that sort of owed her. Why? Because, again, your life was set by these rhythms of disease, of crops, of weather, of where you were born, and there wasn't any change in it. You didn't have a way to get out of there, to just change your world. It just simply wasn't there. Now contrast that with modern life. Mass transportation, migration, education, social mobility, technology, science, medicine, all of these things have made the world a plastic world. Now, again, I'm not saying that these things are bad things. Don't misunderstand. We're just saying that these are the things that had to exist for us to be where we are today, where people can even talk about gender not being fixed, or being fluid, or changing their bodies radically. I mean, this simply was not even possible in the past, where once the world was fixed, and I, from birth, sort of was found my place in that order, and I lived out my life in that fixed position. Now, cultural imagination sees the world as raw material to be shaped by the human will. Whenever I fly over the southwestern United States, and I do that 2 or 3 times a year, I love just staring out the window of the airplane, because you're flying over desert, and they have surveyed, and like everything is laid out in these grids, and yet within the grid is a big circle. Anybody that's ever flown over Southwest, you can see that. And what are they doing? So some landowner owns this square mile, and in it he is irrigating from, they dig way down deep in the earth into the water table, and they bring water up from subterranean water, and then they irrigate in this circle within the square. And it's gorgeous. I mean, you can just flying over it, seeing it. But like prior to this generation, you couldn't do that. The Southwest was barren. There was no crops coming out of the Southwest. Even when I was a kid, there were vegetables that like you couldn't get in the winter. Those you got to wait till summer, at least where it's warm somewhere, and then they truck them in or whatever. But now you pretty much have any vegetable all year long. Now the tomatoes aren't worth eating. They have literally, don't get me started on what they've done to tomatoes. There are books have been written about tomatoes. You know that? Where they've genetically engineered the tomatoes to make them not rot quite so fast, but they lost taste in the process. So you can get tomatoes in the winter. They just don't taste good. You need to grow your own tomatoes, or do what I do, have people who love you who grow their own tomatoes. And that's even better, so you don't have to take care of them. But, good summer tomatoes, fresh from the vine, are better than the hothouse stuff that they sell. But the fact is, we can get tomatoes year-round. We can get corn on the cob year-round. We can do that. At least we could pre-COVID. Don't know how COVID changed all that, but and by the way, the fact that stuff got disrupted during COVID, all of us who were accustomed to that, that's why we're going, where are the chicken wings? I don't know, how did that happen? We're so used to it that when the supply line gets disrupted, we're like, oh, life's not fair. This is bad. But it's just another evidence that we are accustomed to bending nature to our will and to our technology. So we can farm in the desert. We've got glass houses, insecticides, fertilizers. I've told you all before about an old pastor that I knew. He grew up in western Kentucky, named H.H. Overby. He discipled me in 1980, 81. I'd go to his house in Lexington. He was in his 80s then. And he was hard of hearing. And you know why he was hard of hearing? From taking quinine as a child? And why did he take quinine in Western Kentucky as a child in the early 20th century? Malaria. That's exactly right. Now, that's not a thing for us. We don't, here in the United States, you don't worry about malaria. It just doesn't happen. And you sure don't take quinine to keep you from getting it or to treat the symptoms of it. And there was a whole generation of people that were hard of hearing from taking quinine as a child because of malaria, but we've eradicated malaria. When he wrote this book, he mentioned polio. In the last few weeks, we've seen that polio is showing up in the wastewater in New York, and we're going, oh, we thought we had eliminated that. There it is. It's still around. And so, the reaction to that will be interesting to watch, because it's like, hey, wait just a minute. We thought our technology had eradicated something, and yet there it is. It's still around. Now what's going to happen? Interesting to see now with all the, when I was a kid, there was no anti-vax movement. There simply wasn't. They lined us up in first grade or second grade. And how many of you got the scar on your arm still? I mean, we got the little circle thing there, and nobody was showing up down there going, you're putting computer chips in my kid. Why? There were no computer chips. Nobody even thought about that because they didn't exist. It just shows how much has changed in our lifetime. And nature's authority has not been eliminated, but it's been significantly mitigated. Now, every now and then, a tornado occurs, a flood occurs, and we go, hey, just a minute now. And immediately we start thinking, what can we do to absolutely eradicate that? And, we can do flood mitigation somewhat. We saw recently in East Kentucky, we haven't done it completely. And tornadoes, man, that is something we have no control over whatsoever. And you watch those videos of tornadoes, and it's nature's fury. And so we think about things like drought. And I saw this week an article in Smithsonian or something about in Africa now, they're seeding clouds in order to produce rain. And then the questions are, okay, what's this doing to the climate? What happens if we use technological means to produce rain that nature itself would not produce? What's the long-term effect on that? And illustration right at hand. This is the way we think. Medicine, technology, it changes the fundamental relationship of human beings to their environment and to each other. And so the seasons of the year are not as significant as they were in a lot of ways. One thing is we've got air conditioning, we've got heating. It doesn't change our life experience radically between summer and winter anymore. I mean, there's a few inconveniences, that kind of thing, but we control it. Our lives go on. But technology shifts the balance of power from being toward nature to now being toward human agency, and then the competition between those agencies. And it reinforces the focus on the individual. And this is the case that Truman makes, is that all this had to happen to get us where we are. And upon individual satisfaction, and boy, there it is. That's the thing. So the 1960s, the Stones are singing, I can't get no satisfaction, and the 2020s are saying, yes, you can. You can have the life you want, you can live where you want, you can do what you want, you can be what you want. Nature itself is not a boundary. So, Americans have always had this rugged individualism because, the birth of our country was very unique, and it was a country of almost completely immigrants, and everybody left something behind. This became our land, and we could forge it the way we want. And so that sense of rugged individualism is built into us. But now that individualism has, we've said, oh, we're not even bound by the laws of nature and gender. You look at even what's happened. So one of the cases he makes is that societies got their sense of moral code, not specifically from a religion, though a lot did. You had a lot of nation states. You had an official church. The Church of England, for instance, Anglicanism became the official Church of England after Henry VIII. You had the Holy Roman Empire. All those European states were part of Catholicism. But the United States comes and we say, okay, we reject the notion of a state religion, but we accept moral authority that those religions brought us. So that was a different. There was a shift. We accept their we believe there's a moral order that these religions present. I mean, even Jefferson, who is at best a deist, rejects the miracles of the Bible, rejects the resurrection, but Jefferson still believes that there is a God and that this God has endowed all human beings with certain unalienable rights. And among those, now listen, what's our country founded on? The pursuit of there's life, liberty, and the pursuit of, okay, now boy, that's an interesting word, isn't it? And even somewhat a problematic word. But it's what we're founded on. And yet, through the centuries, the notion of happiness changed. So you've got a collapse of traditional authority. These nations that had a state religion, frankly, England still has a state religion, and it's laughable in the sense that, I mean, you know who the head of the Church of England is? Anybody know? It's Queen Elizabeth II. So she's taking that role very seriously. You know who this might shock you, you know who the head of the Church of Scotland is? The titular head of the Church of Scotland? The Prime Minister of England. Whoever the Prime Minister of England is the titular head of the Church of Scotland. Only one Prime Minister has taken that seriously in modern history, and it was Margaret Thatcher. And you must, don't do it now, look up later, Margaret Thatcher's speech on the Holy Spirit and government. You must read it. It's must reading. And she delivered it, I think, when she addressed the Church of Scotland as the head. Now, contrast Margaret Thatcher as the head of the Church of Scotland with Boris Johnson. Now, by the way, I admire Boris Johnson's intellectual ability. That guy is brilliant. I mean, he's brilliant. Can be a bit crazy and a buffoon and all that, but he's brilliant. Yeah, I'll give him that. But Boris Johnson just totally rejects moral authority. He's just not there. As smart as he is, he's rejected that, and I guarantee you, he did nothing in his role as head of the Church of Scotland. But Margaret Thatcher did. Read it. So these nation states that have official religions today, they're not beholden to them at all. It's in England. I think they have the same view of the Church of England as they do of Big Ben or something. It's like we must care for this. This is a relic of our past and part of our heritage, and every Church of England vicar or pastor is paid by the state, not by the church, and that's just for us in America. Like, that's really wild. But again, we look at that and it's pretty laughable because the state, the vast majority of British subjects don't really follow the Church of England, but it's their church, their state church. So in the United States, we rejected any kind of a state church, but we did not reject the moral principles behind it. And our Constitution is really based on the belief that there is such a thing as natural law a higher law than man's law. Because the whole notion of unalienable rights that are bestowed by a creator means that this is rooted in something that no government can give or take away. They can recognize it or refuse to recognize it, but they can't give it or take it away because God gave it. I listened years ago to an interview on NPR. There was a man who had worked for the Smithsonian and traveling in the South and doing oral histories among African Americans, particularly among those that had been former slaves or the children of former slaves, and he interviewed them. And this was in the 1950s or 60s. He goes down there with this recorder and records these interviews for the Smithsonian. And he fancies himself a really, with it, young liberal, and he believes in human rights and civil rights. And he talks about interviewing this one African-American man, this old man. I don't remember if he'd been a slave or his father had, but he was talking to him about slavery and Jim Crow. And this interviewer, at the end of the interview, he volunteered to this man. He said, I want you to know I believe in giving rights to the black man. And he said that the man sort of looked at him and smiled, wryly, and he said, "You got it too, son." And he said, "What?" He said, "You got it too." He said, "What do you mean?" He said, "You got that infected way of thinking that says rights are something for you to give." He said, "God gave them." He said, "You can recognize them. You can do everything in your power to keep me from exercising them, but you can't give them. God gave them." And he said it was just an eye-opening moment. I would just say to you, if there is no such thing as a law that is greater than man's law, that conversation makes no sense. But once you recognize that there's a law that goes beyond any human government, and it's given by God, it cannot be given by anybody else, that there is such a thing as right being right because it's right, not because some society says, "Oh, we think pederasty is okay." Again, we talked about this last week. Here's a whole culture considered one of the most brilliant cultures in the history of the world, all of whom were okay with pederasty. And it just shows you that once you make it about social acceptance and order, you can justify anything. And so what has happened in our country is this erosion of any sense of law that goes beyond human law. We've made it simply the product of social order. And by the way, that's happened. I want to point out that that's happened in church life too. Remember we talked about if you're born in England in the 14th century, you don't choose which church you go to. There's just one church there that you're going to. But today, not only do you get to choose what church, but you get to choose what kind of church, and even what flavor of worship or whatever. I have this conversation a lot with people. People talk to me about music styles and worship. And I'll just tell you, for me, it is far less significant what style of worship a church has. I've worshiped in churches all over the world, from Nigeria to house churches in China and Cuba, and every kind of church in the United States that you can think of, and every kind of worship in the United States you can think of. But I'll tell you what I am against is, like, I've got a friend who pastors a church. You go to their website, they've got 3 services on Sunday morning, and each one of them a different style, and it's like they right there on their website say, you get to choose your style of worship. Now, I'll just tell you, I see that as nothing other than a massive failure of leadership. because it's just basically like it's consumer driven, and you just get to do whatever you like, and you don't have to worry about these other people who like something differently than you, and where is that's just to me the church giving in to consumers things. So I'm fine with a church that says, okay, we're gonna sing these old hymns of the faith with a $2 million pipe organ, and that's what they do. That's fine. That's wonderful. Or if they want to use a praise band, or they want to use a dulcimer and do bluegrass music, I don't care. But I think the consumerist thing of like, hey, you got to cater to my taste. Well, that's just another thing that we're seeing. That's just our individualism, and it's a dangerous thing for us to say, oh, okay, choose what church you attend, and the primary criterion is not what they're preaching. It's not whether or not they preach the gospel. It's some style of building, whether or not they got windows in the building, what kind, do they have pews or theater seats? We've just made it so consumerist, and that's just a bad way of thinking about it. It has to be the primary thing, even in our church life, is that we're driven by the gospel. We're driven by the word of God and faithfulness to that word. And so not only is that happening within the church, on the outside of the church, the culture despisers of religion have dominated the way that religion has been presented in art and literature and pop culture now for decades. Contrast, again, remember I talked about Rembrandt's picture of the crucifixion? And he puts himself in the picture at the foot of the cross, looking up at Jesus. I mean, what a statement he's making. And I remember the thing years ago, I remember when the National Institute and National Endowment for the Arts had paid for this one so-called sculpture, work of art, and it was an upside-down cross in a bottle of urine. You remember that? That made all kinds of news about, that's what we're paying for. I just want to point out that the upside-down cross in the bottle of urine is much more. If you just look at the depictions of religion in contemporary art, and just go to a museum, the ones that are showcased are far more like that one than they are like Rembrandt. I'm talking about modern art. If you go to the Museum of Modern Art in New York, you go to any modern art museums, I would just challenge you to find any positive depiction of religion of any kind. And you just will hardly find it. There might be some examples, but I'm comfortable saying that there would be a lot more examples of negative, and especially, just like what's the Footloose? You remember the movie Footloose? Who's the bad guy in Footloose? It's the preacher. I mean, you can just trace this in American, like Elmer Gantry. The first movie I think that Andy Griffith was in, he plays a crooked preacher, and that's sort of what built his career. I'm glad he didn't stay in that typecast. But depictions of religion have grown. There's just not that many movies being made that give any kind of not mainstream movies being made to give a positive depiction of it. There are some, but usually they're smaller and people that are religious out to prove that religion is not bad. But the vast majority of mainstream stuff is going to portray religion in a negative light. And then you put on top of that all the crises and scandals of different religions, and it makes it even harder. If the last century's been brutal on institutional religious authority, it's been just as hard on the family. So think about, first of all, the assault on the family with no-fault divorce. Go back to, say, the presidency of Andrew Jackson. the big scandal in Andrew Jackson's life was that he had married a divorced woman. And so the First Lady of the United States was a twice married woman, and Jackson's enemies claimed that she did not obtain a legal divorce, and so therefore that they were actually living in sin. And so this was one reason why Andrew Jackson became such a populist. He hated the elites around him that were attacking him constantly about his wife. And it was sort of the first, it wasn't the first sexual scandal in the United States. Alexander Hamilton was one of those, but it was one of the primary ones. And you go from that, where divorce was so strange and so hard to get. I mean, Andrew Jackson's wife, her divorce literally had to be granted by the Virginia legislature. Now think about that. The legislature had to grant your divorce. That's how hard it was to get one. And you just come forward 200 years and, you've got a guy like Larry King. How many times? I think he's been married 8 times. And that's seen with sort of a nod and a smile. So that has lowered the bar for the dissolution of marriage. The wedding vows now change from as long as we both shall live to as long as we both shall love. So the family has changed. The definition of the family has changed. What a family is, who comprises a family, all that's been under attack and change. And then the notion of the nation itself. Even America, founded on not on simply because we're like England, this ancient nation, or Israel, and we're founded on principles by migrants, but even our national creed of freedom is challenged. So was the nation really founded in 1776 with our Declaration of Independence, or was it in 1619 with the arrival of the first slaves? Well, that's the argument that's made now. So, oh no, that's really when the nation was forged, and it was forged on that principle. And again, this is one of the arguments of critical race theory, is that the whole thing has to be deconstructed. Traditionally, Americans have said, we've not lived up to our ideals. We need to do a better job. We need to live up to our ideals, but our ideals that are expressed in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution are the right ones, and now we need to do it better, a more perfect union. But now the movement is, no, that was wrong in its inception, because it was already stained by this original sin of slavery, and therefore the whole thing needs to be dismantled. And that's really what critical theory says. It's about dismantling. Not just the United States, look at Canada and Australia. Do they exist because of the theft of land from and the subsequent exploitation of indigenous peoples? So the narrative of all of these nations have changed. And the nation state is also under attack because of immigration. Now look, I'll be honest with you, I don't know what the solution to immigration problems are. I really don't. It's a tough thing. On the one hand, America has always been welcoming to migrants and said, we want to give you a place to come and to plant your life and to work hard and grow. On the other hand, we've always had to have standards of entering this country, and if you have completely open borders, you don't have a country. It's that simple. If there are no borders and you're not protecting anything, then you have no nation. And so this is the challenge. And you hear cries from both extremes: close all borders, and we got here, we got ours, don't let anybody else in. And then you've got cries on the other hand, it's like, well, it's terrible for you to say no to anybody, and everyone should be welcome here. Well, historically, we've done neither of those things, but here we are with these radical ideas. And I would argue that usually on both ends, people are arguing it from, again, the idea of personal choice, that this is right for me, do this because I think this is right. And what's it's the whole thing of what we've done in this country has provoked other countries to get involved in our internal issues. Like, it's funny, I travel in Israel, and I saw Black Lives Matter signs in stores in November of last year. And it's like, okay, I just don't even understand how you feel the need to weigh in on that when that's not an issue. And by the way, we could easily turn that argument on Israel about their own internal problems. I was in Bellingham, Washington in July, and the same thing. Walking down the street in Bellingham, Washington, every single store downtown Bellingham, Washington had a Black Lives Matter sign in the window. But guess what I did not see in Bellingham, Washington? I saw no black people. And it's like, okay, if you really believe that, then you need to lower your property values here, make it affordable for people of all ethnicities and from all parts of the country to move here and live, on this incredible oceanfront property you've got here. But they're not going to do that, right? It's easier to put a slogan up there than it is to actually change something about what you should do. And so this is sort of where we are. It's like everybody feels valid in speaking out about what everyone else should do. Again, the left really is great at telling everybody what they should do, but San Francisco, about the most liberal city in America, just go downtown San Francisco and see if they're doing anything to help poor people live in downtown San Francisco. And they're not. They're not doing anything. Their property values in downtown San Francisco are extremely high. Go to the landowners and the building owners and say, okay, you need to set aside a certain portion of your properties for poor people to live here. And they're not doing that. I mean, they're using that for their own profit, but at the same time saying what everybody else should do. This is just sort of where we are now. Religious institutions, family, and nation have, even in the recent past, been three fundamental anchors for identity, but now all three of them are being attacked. And once those three lose their authority, or even become sources of shame, this is the thing. I want you to see that they've gone from merely losing their authority that if you stand for any traditional understanding of religious institution, family, or nation, you're called out like you've done something shameful. And without these three things, then there's no real anchor for identity. We've lost, there's the loss of, he talks about the loss of sacred order, cultures that have traditionally justified their moral order by appealing to a sacred order, and the traditions rooted in that order, that's gone. In Western culture, any attachment to a sacred order is gone. And look what's happened once you do that. He talks about three things in particular: contraception, pornography, and sex. That these three things our view of these three things has radically changed. First of all, contraception, there's no question, the 1960s, the advent of the contraceptive pill made promiscuity possible in a way that it had not been before. And the beginnings of the sexual revolution of the 60s was connected to that. But then pornography, it's stunning to me that feminists in the United States have not been more anti-pornography than they've been. But they put themselves in a situation where they sort of can't be. Once you argue for individual freedom, then you feel like you can't say to anybody that, well, consenting adults shouldn't do that. But the reality is pornography is, first of all, it is so detrimental, particularly to women, not exclusively, but particularly to women. We know the dangers about children and child pornography, but I just can't tell you how much marital counseling I've had to do with couples whose whole view of sexuality has been shaped by their own addiction to pornography. And I used to, in my younger days, I used to stand up and talk about, now women aren't, pornography's not an issue with women, it's a man issue. Well, I don't say that anymore. I don't say that anymore at all, because I've learned better. Now that it is ubiquitous and now that it is accessible and free, I've had to change the way I do premarital counseling, and I've certainly had to change the way I do marital counseling. And there are just massive problems in a couple's sex life because of their exposure to pornography. It just is a thing. I'm no longer shocked by it. I don't scold people about it like I'm so disappointed in you. I just have to say, okay, here's how do we deal with this? How do we change? Because you've let the world shape your view of sexuality instead of God. And you've made it a thing. I'll just say this. There's this law of diminishing returns that, this is true in any addiction. That you reach a level where the thing that used to give you pleasure, that's not enough, and you have to go more. You got to do more alcohol, or you got to do more heroin or crack or pornography or whatever it is. What you did was not enough. You got to have a little bit higher kick. And with pornography, it goes beyond mere sex. It goes into all kinds of perverted, twisted, dark, and I would say diminishing and detrimental and hurtful things. And when people are shaped by this, the thought of just having enjoyable sex between a husband and a wife, now they've bought into this. No, we've got to do more. We've got to let the boundaries down. We've got to bring other people in, or we got to experiment with this. And there's just this massive discontentment. And but on top of that, now you've got the argument that it's okay. I literally saw somewhere recently some article about a Christian partner swapping club. And I'm like, okay, that's just insane. And when we let the world shape the way we think, in the book, Truman talked about that there actually is an article of clothing, a onesie that you can get for your child that has written on it, future porn star. And that's a cute and funny thing. And when it's just absolutely terribly sad, this is that our culture has been shaped. You can look at a lot of things. The Kinsey Report, which, by the way, back in the 1990s, I knew a Jewish psychologist named Judith Reitman. And Judith was going around the country talking about the Kinsey Report, how she said, look, the Kinsey Report has all kinds of stuff. It was done, basically, the Kinsey Institute, which was a part of the University of Indiana. And it tells in there, the capacity of infants to have an orgasm, for instance, and how many. And Judith Reitman in the 1980s was saying, okay, how did you do this research? She said, at the heart of this is all kinds of abuse of children. And nobody was listening to her. Nobody was listening to her. In recent years, the Kinsey findings and the Kinsey Institute have been largely discredited, but Masters and Johnson, Kinsey Institute, all of these things that just sort of eroded our boundaries when it came to sexuality and human sexual activity have taken their place. You get the Hugh Hefner effect, which it's ironic now. You've got, I can remember when there was a show on TV about Hugh Hefner's 3 girlfriends. And by the way, they're all now doing podcasts and stuff talking about how they were sexually abused by Hugh Hefner. Okay, I'm just like, I'll be honest, I was saying what Hugh Hefner was doing was wrong when he was doing it, and nobody was listening. I mean, the world was going, you prudes, you got something against sex. What is it with you Baptists and sex that you just have a problem with sex? And I was like, then this is not normal. This is not right. This shouldn't be celebrated. Well, now you've got all these people looking back at it and going, oh, that was sexual abuse. Oh, you think? You think? And yet we're still as out with the culture as we were then. What we were saying then is no more accepted today than it was then. We were right then, we're still right now. Because what we're saying is based on the Word of God and God's view of sexuality. So he sort of concluded this chapter by talking about the revolt of the elites. That the authority that religion used to have has now been passed on to cultural elites. And that would be, the intelligentsia, pop stars, and I saw, on Twitter, stuff comes up in my feed, and I just saw pictures of what, like, male actors were wearing at the Cannes Film Festival this year. And, it's just, you look at it, that's really not just feminine, it's just way out there. And this becomes the norm. This is what our kids are growing up with, held up to them as, well, this is beauty, this is individual expression, and the cultural role has been transformed into its opposite. The fields of politics and art and education and corporate business are now all marked by a negativity toward the past and whatever values and beliefs we once had. Every corporation out there has to virtue signal the new virtue that they're with the program. Just look at what happened recently. That Disney, the CEO of Disney, simply wanted to remain silent on the law in Florida that limits what content can be taught to first, second, and third graders, what sexual education content can be taught. It was called, the other side called it the Don't Say Gay bill, which obviously that's not what it said, but that's, you find some little thing that sounds ridiculous and will stick, and that's what you try and put on your opponent. And because the CEO of Disney wanted to just simply be quiet. He's like, this is Florida's thing, we're not getting in this. But the employees of Disney protested and did a walkout and all kinds of things to force his hand. So Disney takes a stand against the law that simply says parental rights have to be respected, and you don't get to choose whether or not you're going to teach a second grader about transgenderism. This law is just too much for the employees of Disney. So the CEO then caves in, and Disney goes on full record, we're against this law. Well, Florida sort of hit them back and said, okay, then we're taking you. They were treated sort of as a sovereign municipality on their own, and Florida took that away. Okay, you're going to do that, and we're doing this. Did you know that right now the state of California will not pay for any business trips of any state employees to any state or municipality that is not in agreement with their extremely liberal laws about sexuality stuff. So now it's like the employees of California can basically go nowhere. It's like there's just a handful of places they can go. And so if you have the World Series in some city, like your tourism people can't attend, it's just crazy. All this well, we're going to make these people pay. We're going to show that how much displeasure we have. And, they're not bothered by what's going into like music that our children are listening to. I mean, it's just stunning to me when I read the lyric. I'll be honest with you, between having one ear and just not being with it, I can't understand the lyrics most of these times when I see this stuff, but I see some video of some young girl acting overtly sexual or whatever, and I'm like, what's she saying? And then I'll look up the lyrics, and I'm thinking, the fact that students in our youth ministry are listening to this and learning how to twerk, it's terrifying to me. I mean, this is the world my grandkids are growing up in, and to see that the industries, the big businesses are joining in and they're behind it. They're not fighting it. They're not even paying any homage to the past. They've joined the whole movement that says the past is wrong. It has to be undone. I mean, you look at I have no problem with telling the truth, right? Always tell the truth. You want to tell the truth about the fact that Thomas Jefferson was a slave owner? Absolutely, that should be done. You go to Mount Vernon, the story of slavery needs to be told there. It's not ever wrong. The facts are our friends. I'm never against telling the truth. That's always a good thing. But then to say, because here's some person with his imperfect past, that nothing they said or did should be listened to, that everything should be deconstructed, well, then we're going to find ourselves left with absolutely no one. And including, I think Frederick Douglass was probably the greatest American that ever lived. I'm a great admirer of Frederick Douglass. But if you read a biography of Frederick Douglass and learn the way he treated his first wife, you'll be horribly disappointed. And when they think, how could he do that? And Martin Luther King, great man. Martin Luther King had great flaws. Every great man has great flaws. You can't discount everything anybody ever did because of their flaws. You have to just be honest about it. And the same thing is true with institutions. The same thing is true with family units. We're always asking, well, what does God say? And we're not out simply to overthrow the past, no more than we are to idealize it, right? Let's just be honest about it, and let's say, okay, let's grow. Let's learn what are our ideals. But as we go to the radical individualism of our world now, we need to understand, first of all, where it came from, and secondly, it can't be true because it hasn't been, right? If a universal truth is something that's true in every culture and at every time and in every place, and the fact is that things that are now, we're saying, oh, now we have a new truth, individual truth. I get to define my truth. Well, there's a word for that, and that's called anarchy. And it simply doesn't work. The Christian worldview is radically different because what we say is the exact opposite. It's not only not about me, it is expressly about Jesus. And my personal will must be surrendered to his. And that's never a popular message. And Jesus was really honest about it. He said, follow me, and I'll teach you how to express yourself individually and to find true freedom for who you really are. Is that what he said? No, he said, follow me by taking up your cross. You got to die. Following Jesus is a life of crucifixion of the flesh. Today in Romans 6, we're going to see he calls it this body of sin, this dying body, this mortal body, this body of death. And the worst thing we can do is let our bodies determine truth. What has to determine truth is God's will, God's law, and simply because we have the technology does not mean we should do it. There's an article and I read just the sort of the preface of it this morning, but I'm going to read it further. I don't know exactly what the guy's title is, but he is warning, right now we're on the brink of super artificial intelligence. There's artificial intelligence, but then he's predicting by the year 2070, there'll be such a thing as super artificial intelligence that goes far beyond any human abilities of thinking. And he's warning that this is actually an existential threat to humanity. Now, I will tell you, my reading of the scripture, I'm not worried about humanity being wiped out by something because the Bible tells me how it ends. And it's not because of a nuclear war, and it's not because of super artificial intelligence. The world ends when, the world as it is ends when the Lord Jesus returns to establish a rule and reign of righteousness. But my point is that when we don't have any moral boundaries, what happens to any artificial intelligence we set up? And this continues to come out. I just remember when was it IBM that had they used artificial intelligence for some bot on Twitter, and it was like this bot was, by interacting with humans, was supposed to pick up, basically human traits and be able to converse exactly like they were. Within 48 hours, they shut the thing down because it had become a racist, all this stuff that it was, indeed, it had become just like us. And with all of our sinful tendencies, and they actually shut it down and okay, so the next time they put it out there, they had to put restraints on it. Well, okay, so you're saying don't be like us, but don't be too much like us. Because if you're too much like us, you point out what we really are. So here's the challenge for us, is to live in a world that rejects divine authority, but to stand up for divine authority and say, this is what's true. It's true not because of my individual expression, it's true because God has said it, and that I'm going to accept biblical truth over my feelings, over my culture, over anything, because the Word of God is infallible. It's what God has declared, and let God be true and every man a liar. Thank you.